the National Institute for Global Health. The question is acknowledging the bank's work, which recognizes that pro-poor policies have reached the poor last, and the questions that Dr. Evans resonated towards the end of her presentation on for whom, and potentially placing the $1.25 or above. Have we captured the sense of the entire population around the 1.25 measurement? Are we missing groups of populations for whom that 1.25 in the pocket is not a possibility? They do not have pockets at all. So have we captured that sense of the magnitude of the population? And in that way, if Dr. Evans were to give the steer to the high-level committee on which sections of the 1.25, how many standard deviations above and below would you go for in order to have the impact of coverage would you offer? Thank you.
Should we take a few, or do you want me to?
Oh, no, I think we'll take everything.
Thank you for your question. I mean, as I take from your question, an important point that, an international poverty line like $1.25, which at the moment is used to define sort of absolute poverty, it has huge value. But what's the story behind it? Who's really covered by that, and what forms of kind of extreme deprivation are we talking about for people living on such incredibly sort of meager levels of income? And I think some of the work that I was trying to draw your attention to, which is now looking to sort of decompose numbers of people who are either close to the $1.25 line and those that are actually well below it. I mean, what economists call the sort of poverty gap. Increasing attention to actually the fact that there are vast numbers of people who are far from that line suggests that their deprivation is even deeper and even more severe than perhaps we sometimes allow for. Now, there is a very, as I'm sure you know, in the international scene, a very active debate about do we to continue to use $1.25? Should we be looking increasingly to $2 a day as a sensible poverty line to begin to capture more people living in serious forms of poverty? I mean, actually, I think there's also a movement to say, well, even at $2 a day, what are we talking about, really? Think about it. I mean, Charles Kenny, who some of you may know, who's been doing some very interesting work on progress on poverty reduction, amongst other things, recently said, well, just think about that for a moment. For those of us living in advanced economies, that's less than a frappuccino in Starbucks. People living on $2 a day still represents an extraordinary level of deprivation. So we have to be careful not to treat these poverty lines too lightly. I mean, as it is, even, maybe we should be, for the post-2015 framework, starting to operate at poverty lines are actually much higher than that, so we capture many more people. Maybe it should be $10 a day, because we're still talking about very high levels of going without, of people who are not able to access a minimum standard of life, and it still sets a very ambitious agenda for post-2015. My own view, as I indicated, is that I think we will not be successful in the post-2015 framework if we don't broaden the conversation around poverty. At the same time, if we broaden it to the point where we lose focus on where extreme poverty still persists, I think we will also be in danger. So I think there's a real balancing act to be achieved there, and I think the high-level panel has got its work cut out in terms of coming down on the right side of that debate. But as somebody said recently, and I can't remember who, but there's going to be no point in, given the kind of inequalities also that are now becoming more and more evident, and I alluded to, if the high-level panel starts recommending a set of goals that are sort of strong on absolute poverty, but weak on relative poverty. And I think, we need to get the balance between those things right.
Here next.
Mark Purcell from the Australian Council for International Development. Thanks to both speakers for great presentations. My question's for Dr. Rodgers. In the light of the upcoming Pacific Island Forum meeting in the Marshall Islands and then next year's international meeting of small island states in the Pacific, it's in regards to climate change. What is this position of SPC in regards to a safe level of temperature rise? Is it 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees? I've seen different positions coming from Pacific Island Forum leaders over the last couple of meetings. And secondly, in regards to funding for climate change and new and additional funding, what would you like to see, or SPC like to see, at the PIF in August? Of that $250 approximately that goes to small island states, should funding for climate change, for adaptation finance, be coming from that $250, or should it be additional?
Okay, thank you. There's quite a array of different degrees being talked about on climate change, the acceptable rises. What's fairly sure to us is that we're already on a 2 degrees rise, regardless of what we do. I think if we stop the meeting now, it's fairly well guaranteed we're already at the 2 degrees. So I think anything below 2 degrees is, for us, not really worth talking about. The same work that we've done actually says that if we start modulating, it's very, very likely that we'll hit a 3 to 4 degrees raise by the next 20 years. So I think these ones are very, very important. If we then put that across the context and with news coming in of the polar ice melting, that gets even more worrying. The distribution of water and sea level rise is not standard across. There are some parts of the world where it's higher and some that are lower. And unfortunately, parts of the Pacific will be part where it is higher. So that does raise a concern for us. And I think really, the forum meeting in Marshall Islands is very good. I mean, I think the fact is that if we have leaders coming into that meeting and experience their life on an atoll island country, to actually see the reality on the ground. Sometimes in New York, people make statements without actually seeing the realities of how people live in the countries that are coming. And Marshall Islands is a good example, where you're about 1 meter above sea level. Where at high tide, it's coming onto the road. Imagine yourself living there for 20, 30 years instead of visiting for 2 days. And then you'll start to realize what the people are saying and probably take a little bit more seriously the issues that they are raising. So I think that point is important. In terms of where funding goes and how it's used in the Pacific, it's got to be on adaptation. We are not big emitters, so mitigation issues really, we can research it, we can study it. We've done a research on Pacific fisheries, impact of climate change, and what that shows is that the fish stocks are actually going to go down in many of these countries. The tuna fisheries is moving eastwards, therefore looking at fish for protein. Pacific people are the highest consumers of fish. They don't have too much cattle, so without fish, malnutrition comes in and goes on the other area. There is potential for aquaculture in the larger island countries like Papua New Guinea, Solomons, but not in the small island countries. So again, I think we have an issue there of how do we use funds. The first thing is to actually link climate change and disaster. They are taken as two separate entities. If we can manage risks, we can manage some of the impacts of climate change. And I think that's got to be, that funds could very well be used in looking at linking disaster risk preparedness, managing risks that actually then help adapt against climate change events long term. Many of the countries need to have a look at climate proofing in the Pacific, and that's to do both with housing and bridges. The highest point in Kiribati, for those of you that have been to Kiribati, is a causeway between two islands. So if you've got a high tidal, the safest place to be is on that causeway, provided it doesn't run off. So that does raise the whole issue, I guess, of importance of highlighting some of the areas on disaster and linking it to climate change adaptation. Food security and water security is a crucial problem. Marshall Islands has just declared a state of emergency because of water shortage. And that in atoll island countries, if water is life, well, life is not sustainable without water. And so there's going to be an issue on food security. Adaptation, we're working on areas, for instance, on developing climate-tolerant seeds. And I can see SGR here, they're sort of helping support some of the program, but it's basically to say that we need to have seeds that grow in high saline environment in atoll island countries that we develop and then pass on to this country. So already some of that work is happening. But I think if we look longer term, whether it's 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees, the scenario that we have now in many Pacific countries on food security, water security will get worse. Because of climate variability, we have more frequent, bigger cyclones that will blow off buildings, so climate proofing is important. And I think this is very important, coming back to development partner investment, where infrastructure is actually one of the key things that some development partners want to do. Unfortunately, sometimes the design of infrastructure is actually costing the countries a lot more. We need to be careful with that. In particular, huge buildings that require air conditioning services. I know one country, for instance, that used to pay electricity bill $12,000 per year. It's now $12,000 a month. So I think development aid coming into some of these countries is very, very important. But if their design of some of the infrastructure does not involve local considerations, they could actually be committing the countries to even more expenditure.
Thank you very much. And just here, please. We've got quite a number of people wanting to ask questions and only about 5 minutes, so we might need to have short answers if possible and concise questions.
Thank you. Julie Dorfors from the Office of National Assessments in Canberra. Thanks for very interesting presentations and a number of issues that would be very interesting to follow up later, but I'll confine myself to one particular question. Alison, you mentioned that the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation had been overtaken by events. Meanwhile, we've got the UN trying to lead post-2015 processes. We've got the G20 with a development agenda bringing traditional donors together with emerging economies. Just wondering what your thoughts are on the extent to which international cooperation on aid and development is feasible or useful in the current environment, or to put it another way, is the global aid and development architecture up to the task and does it matter?
Okay, I do a short answer on that. Maybe we should have coffee. Just 2 things maybe as a quick reaction to that. I mean, I think the way you pose the question in a sense is quite right. We are, in a way, sort of searching for a direction of travel here, and there are obviously multiple processes that are going to be placing very considerable demands on the international community going forward, and we're, as yet, not quite sure how this is going to come together. And, I think that we've missed an opportunity a bit with the G20, and it would be very nice to see the G20 coming back into the space on development, not about aid so much, but about development partnership and new forms of financing. And I think there's been an element there of the continuing sort of long shadow of the financial crisis taking away some of the energy from that, which is a real shame. So Australia next year, you're hosting the G20. We're going to put the ball in your court to kind of bring that back in and give it some real welly. But I suppose very, very quickly, I do think we need to repurpose a little bit the context for development cooperation going forward. There's some huge opportunities as well as challenges. In my own mind, and I think where the global partnership could go, and to some extent I think this is what it was trying to do at its inception, but it's really struggled with the sort of underlying politics and who's around the table, but is to actually make it much more problem-focused, problem-solutions-focused, which is rather than trying to set up a global architecture that is all singing and all dancing, we need to now be much more focused on where are the shared problems, how can we bring global development actors together with other actors in a spirit of cooperation to sort of solve those problems, and to make it much more focused on solving those shared problems. And that's the direction of travel I'd like to see it go in, but I do think it's going to require some real leadership, and I think we're feeling a little bit of a lack of that coming forth in the UK at the moment.
Just over at the back, right at the very back, thanks.
Chris Roach from La Trobe University. Alison, you mentioned we're going to need more creativity, ingenuity, risk-taking. You also mentioned the domestic political pressures on donors to be pushing for and communicating short-term results, value for money and the rest of it. How do you think we might shift the kind of political dynamics in donor countries so that ingenuity and creativity is actually encouraged?
I don't have the answer. I posed it as a challenge, if you remember, and a disruptor. I mean, I do think this is really, really important. And I suppose I would like to think that we're going to come up with some of the ideas around that today. I mean, what I will say is, I'm not going to offer pat answers to that, but what I will say is that I certainly see a bit of a shift in the UK on that. And I think there's been a slight stultifying effect on, the UK aid agenda was actually very creative and very progressive, and still has many of those qualities. Let me not suggest that it doesn't, but they are being somewhat boxed in by the need to constantly sort of attend to the requirements of the sort of what is auditable and what will pass muster, if you like, with a sceptical public. And I do think we need to try and reopen the debate about what aid is for, and to really get very robust with some of the evidence about how long it takes for aid to really deliver results, where aid needs to come alongside other sorts of financial flows to really be more pro-risk, in whether it's in fragile settings or on some of the big, game-changing challenges like climate, and really begin to produce the stories of success that begin to influence this sceptical mood that unless it's countable, measurable, visible, it isn't worth doing. And I think we do need to come up with much more compelling stories, communicable stories about how support for institutional development, for example, actually makes a difference. So the hard stuff, but also how some of these new ways of working in the climate space and elsewhere are beginning to yield dividends.
There's one, yes, there.
Like Dan Evans, Business for Millennium Development, I'd like to add my vote of thanks to both of you for wonderful presentations. Alison, you didn't reference the role of the private sector very much. The question for you is, what do you see as their potential role, and what are the key hurdles in achieving it?
I mean, I certainly didn't mean to, in any sense, kind of leave out the private sector. And I think in my efforts to sort of describe this changing financial landscape and actor space, the private sector is firmly in there, both in its role in engaging in new forms of sort of social impact investment, but also in its traditional role as corporate investors and so forth. I mean, I think this is a really important place for us to sort of be exploring all kinds of new and interesting solutions to development challenges. I mean, I think there are good examples out there which we need to disseminate around working in partnership between public and private sector. I think there is a movement amongst a number of private sector partners to get very involved in, essentially solving public goods problems, because it's in their interest, it's in their long-term interest. There is a kind of convergence of interest in the long term between some, what the private sector needs and also what is good for poverty reduction. So I think we need to harness that. And I think there's a huge opportunity in post-2015 to really provide a framework that makes sense for that to deliver. And just as MDG 8 has been pretty much not an entire failure, but a fail to really get to grips with the obligations for the development community, particularly, I think there's a potential to rewrite that script in post-2015. So I hope there's a really strong message from the high-level panel and the post-2015 framework about working much more closely with the private sector. But just the footnote, of course, is that I think there are huge obligations in the private sector also, which are not always entirely taken up or acknowledged by corporate actors around their broader corporate responsibilities and license to operate, which we also need to keep the pressure up.
Thank you. Just a question, Chi Eung from Asia Australia Mental Health. Just a question to Dr. Jimmie Rodgers. Recently, we brought a small team to Solomon Islands to deliver disaster mental health response after the tsunami in the Tuamotu province. It was surprised us because it was actually a very new concept, and it was the first time it had actually been brought to the country. Could you comment on how do we best engage development aid in terms of disaster preparedness for the Pacific?
Yeah, it is an interesting question because it's one that's not really up in the high priorities in many of the health sectors in the Pacific. But I think it's a natural question that follows that what does development generate and what does inequality of share distribution lead to? I think, in a sense, the best place to start is really the ministries of health themselves. They need to have a look at if they don't address the challenges to do with mental health now and pick it up early, it's going to end up with a big problem later. And also, in particular, in response to disasters, because people think about the human aspects of it, the shelter, the food, but they don't think about the psychological impact of how does one cope with what they've lost, whether it's people or gardens. And I think it's not very well addressed in many parts of the Pacific, and definitely an area that really needs to be looked at. If you look at the inequalities, the whole issue that came up in the Solomons before Ramsey, quite a lot of that can be tracked back to, inequality of resource sharing and how that impacts on psychological positioning of people and how that then leads up to something else. So I guess I'm agreeing with you that it's a priority. It's not really being addressed in a systematic way and needs to be.